He donated blood. Now the alien nurse says he's pregnant with her royal heir. The night before everything changed, Isaac Thorne was sitting on a corroded metal bench in a drafty corridor of the Celestine Frontier Clinic, counting the overhead flickers of phosphorescent lights. He couldn't sleep. Between the resonant hum of distant machinery and the sharp smell of antiseptics that stung his nostrils, he felt a pressure building behind his eyes like a headache that refused to crest. He'd been stationed here on Calras Station as a civilian defense consultant, an ironic retirement for a man who used to dismantle bombs for the Earth Marine Corps. A few years ago, an IED had left his left shoulder full of metal shards. He still felt phantom twinges, like ghostly insects crawling under his skin. It was the kind of old wound that never truly healed, physically or emotionally, which only made it more bizarre that his official reason for coming to the clinic was something as mundane as a routine blood donation. On Calrath, humans and several allied species coexisted, each with unique biochemical signatures. The station required daily infusions of Earth-based blood types for emergencies. Isaac was O-negative, universal donor, making him even more valuable. He gave blood every month, not out of charity or heroism, but because he needed the station credits. Still, part of him liked the idea of being useful. At least, that's what he told himself as he exhaled slowly in that corridor, trying not to dwell on the bullet scars that shaped his nightmares. He had just begun drifting off when a sudden sharp clang announced the entrance of the nurse. Her name was Kirith, though Isaac rarely saw her outside of blood draws. In silhouette, she appeared impossibly tall and lean, with two angled horns curving backward from her temples and an elegant, scaled crest that shimmered beneath the bright overhead lights. She was one of the Zalvari, a species known across the sector for both their advanced medical technology and their imposing regal posture. Kirith walked with that unhurried grace, each step exuding a coiled tension as if she were always, unconsciously, assessing potential threats. He could see her large, dark eyes scanning him. Her uniform clung to her lithe frame, shimmering in the same shade of teal that matched the station's medical wards. She didn't speak at first, just looked at him with an intensity that made him acutely aware of his own sweaty t-shirt and oil-stained cargo pants. He cleared his throat, forcing out a grunt of acknowledgement. "You're here late," she said. Her voice had a slight reverberating quality, as if an echo followed every sound she made. "Couldn't sleep," he replied. "And you?" "Busy shift. My duty cycle's not over for another 5 hours." He nodded. Typically, the Zalvari had longer day cycles than humans, something to do with the rotation of their home planet, a perpetually twilight world. He tried not to stare at the subtle patterns across her temples and cheekbones, an iridescent swirl of jade and silver that seemed to shift in the flickering corridor light. She was beautiful in a strangely unsettling way. The Zalvari had a reptilian elegance, but also something decidedly humanoid about their posture and expression. She gestured for him to follow her into the small medical bay. When she waved her hand over a sensor, the doors slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, everything was clinical white with luminous screens arrayed across the walls. On a nearby shelf stood vials, syringes, and half a dozen scanning devices that Isaac couldn't begin to name. Kirith directed him to lie on an adjustable bed. He complied, gingerly lowering himself, ignoring the slight pinch in his shoulder. She attached a sterile needle to a vacuum syringe, precisely positioning it against the faint vein in his arm. He felt the prick of it, and as the blood started flowing, he observed the intricacy of her scaled arms. Not reptile skin exactly. Zalvari looked more like layered crystals beneath a thin layer of smooth hide. Her eyes darted toward his face. "You seem tense," she remarked softly, pressing a button on the monitor so that the vacuum suction stabilized. "Tense, me? Nah," he said wryly. "I'm at my best when someone's draining me of a pint of my life." She offered him a small twitch of her lips that might have been the Zalvari version of a smirk. "I've never met a man quite as sarcastic about giving blood." "I aim to impress," he said. "How's that going for you?" "Not entirely unpleasant." She returned her focus to the readouts on the screen. "Your protein levels are still high, which is good. Your blood cells are dividing properly." Are you feeling any lightheadedness? No more than usual. He tried to shrug and ended up wincing at the pull in his shoulder. I'm used to this. Shouldn't be anything weird, right? She exhaled softly in what he assumed was mild exasperation. Right. We usually do a quick readjustment for fluid balance. Lie still. He nodded, allowing his mind to drift as the machine quietly whirred. Everything about the procedure seemed standard until the moment her handheld scanner beeped in an unusual pattern. Kirith tilted her head. Her dark eyes narrowed, and she tapped a few luminous buttons. Isaac lifted his head slightly to watch. Is something wrong? He asked. The corners of her lips pressed together. It's probably nothing, she said in an oddly tentative voice. I'm picking up an anomaly in your cellular structure. Likely a glitch with the scanner. He made a face. Anomaly in my no. Don't do that. Don't hide behind medical jargon. If something's up with me, I need to know. She appeared momentarily conflicted. I'll run a deeper analysis. She set aside the needle, withdrew a small vial of his blood, and placed it into another device. The machine beeped, and a swirling holographic representation of his cells projected in midair. Isaac watched in bafflement as Kiritha's face turned very still. A faint tremble coursed through her second eyelids, which was a Zalvari sign of shock. His chest tightened. You're scaring me, nurse. Kirith, she corrected quietly, without looking away from the swirling data. I need to verify something. She typed in a series of commands in her species text script. The hologram flickered and zoomed in further. Isaac watched with mounting unease. He saw what looked like spindly filaments hooking into red blood cells. A ripple of some luminescent energy coursed along the edges. He swallowed. This is new, I take it? She nodded. Yes. It appears there's been a hybridization pattern. I can't confirm yet. There's something reminiscent of Zalvari genetic markers in your blood sample. She took a slow breath, as though trying to keep herself calm. That's not possible, unless you've recently had direct fluid contact with a Zalvari. His eyebrows shot up. Direct fluid contact? You mean like bodily fluids? A jolt of memory made him recall the last time he'd caught a lung infection on a salvage mission. Could that have triggered something? But that was nearly a year ago, and it was with a fully human crew. I've never. Her gaze locked on his, and a strange tension pulsed through the air. He felt his stomach twisting as he realized how unbelievably serious she looked. We need to run more tests. My apologies, she said, and her voice had gone hollow. We'll have to keep you in observation tonight. Isaac exhaled sharply. The overhead lights seemed to intensify, washing out the corners of the room. You can't just drop that bombshell and leave me in suspense. What the hell is going on? Kirith hesitated, her eyes drifting to the swirling hologram once more. Then she slowly removed her gloves, revealing slender, graceful fingers tipped with a metallic sheen. I'm not entirely sure yet, she said in a voice barely above a whisper. But if what I'm seeing is accurate, you've undergone partial insemination. And you're not just carrying any Zalvari trait, it appears to be from the royal line. The sentence hung between them like a live wire. Isaac felt the blood drain from his face, which was ironic, considering he just donated a pint of it. That's impossible, he croaked. She looked at him with a mixture of worry, fascination, and something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. I'm aware it should be, she said softly. Yet here you are. Isaac spent the rest of the night inside a small isolation suite adjacent to the main medical bay. His mind ran in circles while the overhead light hummed. He tried to sleep in the narrow bed, but the mattress was as cold as an autopsy slab. Every time he closed his eyes, anxiety coiled in his gut, and his pulse spiked with half-imagined horrors. The word insemination kept echoing in his mind, mingling with the memory of Kiritha's stunned expression. Royal line? That sounded far more complicated than just, we found an extra chromosome. Hours later, the door hissed open. Kirith stepped inside, and the look she wore was grim enough to make Isaac's heart skip. She didn't say anything immediately, just handed him a container of some bright green nutritional supplement that smelled vaguely of mint and sea brine. Drink, she said. Your body's metabolism is spiking, and I'm trying to keep everything stable. He eyed it suspiciously but took a tentative sip. It had a shockingly rich flavor that flooded his mouth, reminding him of salted melon rind. Okay, he managed when he swallowed. Now tell me the verdict. She folded her arms. I've run multiple scans. I even recalibrated the entire rig to ensure no cross-contamination. The result is consistent. You have a Zalvari gestational imprint. He tried to steady his breathing. Gestational imprint. That means what, exactly? Her tail, he hadn't noticed it much before, flicked nervously, the tip curling and uncurling around one of her ankles. She spoke carefully, choosing each word as if it might shatter. We Zalvari reproduce in a unique fashion. Our royal line, in particular, has a rare biological capability. The female can essentially deposit a portion of her genetic essence into a compatible host. That deposit, if the host survives, can develop into a fetus. But such a thing would normally only be done deliberately. It's not something that happens by accident. Isaac's cheeks warmed, even as he struggled to process the surreal logic of her statement. So you're saying, I'm pregnant? In some twisted alien sense? Kirith flinched slightly, and her crest flattened. Yes. Though typically only Zalvari are chosen as surrogates. The royal line is revered, and the continuation of that lineage is essential for certain aspects of our governance and telepathic link heritage. For this to happen with a human is... She paused, wrestling with the words. Frankly, it's unprecedented. The embryo's gene fragments are currently in an early flux state, which means it's more like a cluster of specialized cells. But it's definitely developing. He set aside the drink and pressed the heel of his palm into his temple, trying to fight off a sudden wave of dizziness. This is insane. I haven't had intimate contact with any Zalvari, least of all a royal one. So how the hell did this happen? Her dark eyes flickered with an unreadable light. That's exactly what I need to find out, she whispered. She took a careful step toward him, close enough that he could see the subtle lines of color swirling beneath her skin. Isaac, are you absolutely sure you haven't? He grimaced, a humorless laugh escaping his throat. Trust me, I'd remember if I'd done anything like that. It could also be a carefully orchestrated sabotage, she said slowly. Or a forced insemination technique. Perhaps the Zalvari monarchy is using you for some grand scheme. He stared at her. Seriously? A conspiracy to impregnate a random ex-soldier from Earth? She ran a hand over her horns. I'm not saying it makes sense. We Zalvari revere the royal line above all else. If someone wanted to create a new heir in secrecy, you might be an unwitting pawn. Her gaze lingered on him, a mixture of sympathy and professional distance. I'm the assigned nurse for all new species medical anomalies on this station, so I feel obligated to help you navigate this. His throat felt tight. Help me navigate what? The next 9 months? He realized he was shaking, half with fury, half with fear. God, I can't believe I just said that. This can't be real. She stepped even closer, lowering her voice. I assure you, it's real. The question is what we do next. The Zalvari monarchy will eventually become aware of this. They keep close tabs on all royal lineage matters. If they suspect there's an unorthodox pregnancy, they'll either seize it or terminate it. Isaac swallowed. That's comforting. She placed a hand, soft, warm, surprisingly delicate, on his forearm. I'm going to keep this under the radar for as long as I can. But you have to trust me. He looked at her, feeling a strange twist of conflicting emotions. Part of him instinctively recoiled at the idea of trusting a Zalvari at all. He'd heard stories, some good, some horrifying. Yet there was something in her dark gaze that spoke of genuine concern. I don't have much choice, he murmured at last. I'm stuck in an insane situation. A faint flash of empathy crossed her face. We both are. He tried to swallow back the rising wave of panic. If this thing is really inside me, how does it even develop? Humans can't just. He took a breath, trying to ground himself. We're not built for that. Normally, no, she said gently. But the embryo is rewriting certain aspects of your physiology. Your blood results show accelerated cell regeneration and an unusual protein that might be forming a new organ. That could act as a cradle for the embryo. You'll likely experience changes. Quickly. She took a second to let that settle. I'm sorry. He closed his eyes, letting the reality sink in. The soldier in him wanted to remain stoic, to treat it like a mission, gather intel, make a plan, eliminate threats. But the emotional part of him was unraveling. He thought back to the war, to the times he'd lost comrades on the field, to the guilt he carried for surviving. This was a cosmic curveball that dwarfed all that trauma. I'm going to need a little more than sorry, he said, opening his eyes to meet her gaze. I need your help, Kirith. I can't do this alone. She nodded, and her voice was as soft as a vow. You have it. In the days that followed, Isaac learned how claustrophobic the word quarantine could feel. The Celestine Frontier Clinic put him on restricted movement under the guise of a possible infection that threatened other station inhabitants. It was partially true. No one had the faintest clue whether his newly transformed body posed a viral risk. Kirith insisted on the measure to buy time, reassuring him that this story would keep the station authorities off his back until they knew more. He found himself in a small corner suite behind layers of translucent safety screens. Staff occasionally passed the corridor outside, casting curious glances, but few lingered. The rumor was that he'd been exposed to a lethal pathogen while donating blood. That kept the gawkers away. Kirith herself visited multiple times a day, bringing new scanning devices, nutrient concoctions, and questions for Isaac that ranged from his dietary preferences to his dream patterns. On the second day, she explained more about the royal lineage, her voice hushed with reverence and apprehension. Zalvari monarchy is not just political. It's biological, she told him while adjusting a scanning wand near his abdomen. She was close enough that Isaac could smell her faint, musky scent, a bit like petrichor after a fresh rain. Each heir has an enhanced telepathic capacity that allows them to maintain communal links among our people. If that link is severed or abused, it can lead to chaos or tyranny. That's why the succession line is so strictly guarded. He grimaced. So you're telling me I'm carrying an alien psychic baby that might become the next space emperor? She gave him that small, quicksilver half-smile that was more in her eyes than her mouth. Emperor is an overstatement. Still, a child of the royal line wields enormous influence. The monarchy might do anything to reclaim it. A wave of dread washed through him. Do they even care if the host is alive? The look on her face was enough of an answer. She shook her head quietly, setting aside the device she'd used to skin him. I intend to make sure it doesn't come to that, she said firmly. He swallowed the lump in his throat, trying not to let panic seize him. I appreciate that, but how? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she tapped her slender fingers on the handheld scanner, looking lost in thought. I'm in contact with a colleague at the remote research outpost on Cowritha's surface. They study Zalvari genetics outside the monarchy's direct oversight. If I can get you down there, they might have the resources to help us understand this pregnancy and keep it hidden. Isaac blew out a breath. So we'd have to leave the station. That's the idea. But first, I have to navigate station security, and they're not going to just let a potentially contagious patient waltz off. She paused, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face. Also, there's the matter of how you're feeling physically. He'd been trying to ignore it, but the truth was that he felt different. His stomach churned unpredictably. His energy levels soared and crashed. His sense of smell had become unnervingly keen. A few times he swore he felt a strange flutter inside, like a muscle spasm in his lower torso, but deeper and more alien. I'm alive for now, he said, forcing a sardonic smile. So let's move before that changes. Kirith nodded, but a tension lined her features. I'll put everything in motion. It might take a couple of days to arrange. Until then, try to stay calm. Calm, he echoed flatly. Sure. She stood in the threshold of his quarantine cell, her silhouette luminous against the corridor lights. For a moment, their gazes locked. Isaac couldn't help but notice the flicker of compassion in her eyes. Compassion, and something else, like a quiet admiration or respect. He wondered if she, too, sensed the bizarre intimacy of their situation. She was the only one who knew his secret. And the secret itself was beyond comprehension. Then the door slid shut, leaving him alone with the low hum of the station's ventilation. He let out a tremulous breath. In that moment, he felt more isolated than ever before. Yet in the corners of that isolation, he felt a tiny ember of gratitude for Kiritha's presence. She was the only thread tethering him to sanity, the only one who seemed to understand. And in the hollows of his chest, behind the fear, something else trembled. A flicker of protective instinct, like an echo of paternal responsibility, primal and new. The sensation both terrified and oddly steadied him. Maybe he was losing his mind. But if so, he couldn't help wondering if Kirith was willing to lose hers alongside him. Days bled together, and his solitude pressed down like a physical weight. Isaac had long since paced every inch of the quarantine cell, counting the steps from one wall to the other. He tried to distract himself with station broadcasts and reading the data slabs Kirith provided, brushing up on general xenobiology. Nothing helped the sinking feeling in his gut. Occasionally, a nurse from the station's staff would come by, usually a human or a Balorian with fuzzy antennae, and ask if he needed anything. He'd force a polite smile and say, "No, thanks," while their eyes dipped away, fearful or dismissive. He was the quarantined soldier with an alien infection. That was the rumor. And it wasn't even that far from the truth. Then, one afternoon, Kira stepped into the cell, sealing the door behind her with a resolute hiss. She wore a small satchel slung over one shoulder. Her normally poised demeanor had given way to tension in her spine, and there was urgency in the way her tail lashed behind her. "I've got clearance," she said quietly, glancing at the cameras in the corners. She spoke in a hushed tone, nearly a whisper. "We're leaving tonight." Isaac stood up from the bed, ignoring the slight wooziness. "How?" "I arranged a medical transfer to the planet's surface. The official record says you're undergoing advanced treatment for an invasive blood pathogen. We'll be taken by shuttle. Once we land, I can lead you to my contact in the southwestern desert outpost." His heart hammered. "Are we sure your monarchy won't catch wind of this?" She lifted her chin, eyes steeled with determination. "No. But I'm not willing to wait around until they do. The monarchy is cautious with station authority. They'll need official documents or direct evidence. If we leave now, we might slip past them entirely." She opened the satchel and handed him a small injection device. "This is a sedative that'll mimic serious illness symptoms. Security won't question it if you look half-conscious on the meds sled. Once we're clear of the station, I can administer an antidote." Isaac eyed the device warily. "That sounds risky." "It is," she admitted. "But it's our best shot." She stepped closer, and for a moment, her large, luminous eyes searched his face. "We have to protect you, and the child. If we succeed, we'll have a chance to figure out how to handle this pregnancy safely." He swallowed, sensing how close they were physically. He could feel her body heat, the faint scent of her hair, something warm and metallic. Her presence was strangely reassuring. "All right," he muttered. "Let's do it." She nodded, pressing the injector against his arm. There was a short hiss, and Isaac felt a cold sensation shoot through his veins. Immediately, his body sagged, muscles going slack. His vision blurred at the edges. "Easy," Kirith whispered, sliding an arm around his waist to steady him. "I've got you." He blinked, dazed, as she guided him onto a hover gurney that she must have parked outside the door. He felt her slender fingers fastening a harness across his chest. The overhead lights took on a fuzzy halo, and the sounds around him became muffled. A small part of him felt fear gnawing at his mind, but the sedative lulled him into a dark calm. Trust her, a voice inside repeated. Trust her. Everything became a dreamlike swirl as Kirith wheeled him out of the cell. In the corridors, he caught glimpses of passing faces. Station personnel parted as the nurse and her patient moved through. He saw the steel of the docking bay, half-lidded, with the station's insignia stenciled on the walls. The sedation made him feel like he was drifting underwater. He tried to keep Kirith's face in his line of sight, a single point of focus. She murmured something to a security checkpoint. He heard distant voices. Then a green light beeped overhead. The door hissed, and they continued forward. Soon, he felt a change in air pressure, a new hum that signaled they'd entered the shuttle. He tried to stay conscious, but the sedation weighed heavily on him, tugging him into slumber. The last thing he recalled was Kirith's hand brushing across his forehead, a gesture both clinical and tender. Then he sank into darkness, carried by the gentle vibrations of engines. When Isaac woke, his mouth was dry, and the hum of engines was gone. He found himself lying on a cot in a small, dimly lit room with metal walls that glowed with faint red dust. For a confused moment, he wondered if he was back on Earth, stuck in some old cargo hangar. Then a swirl of tinted sunlight spilled through a circular overhead hatch, painting the room with the color of an alien sunset. He shifted, wincing as he propped himself up. Kirith sat across from him on a low bench, tapping on a handheld device. She looked up the instant he moved. Relief visibly softened her features. "You're awake," she said, stepping over to him. "How do you feel?" He swallowed thickly, clearing the dryness from his throat. "Like I got run over by a cargo freighter. But functional, I guess." He took in the cramped space. "Where are we?" "The southwestern sector of Kalratha's desert region," she said, offering him a canteen. "This outpost is a research facility hidden beneath the sands, run by a Zalvari scientist who's not exactly loyal to the monarchy." He took a long drink, nearly choking at the strong mineral taste. "And I take it we're not exactly safe yet?" A dry, humorless smile flitted across her lips. "Safer than on the station. But we'll need to lie low. My contact, Corleth, is preparing a set of specialized scans to analyze your physiology more thoroughly. He's curious, and also alarmed. If the monarchy learns of this, they might send a retrieval team." Isaac tensed, the canteen clutched in his hands. "So we're basically outlaws?" She lifted one shoulder in a half-shrug. "Outlaws with a cause. Kalrath is outside the monarchy's direct jurisdiction, so they can't openly march in here. Still, discreet agents could be sent." She paused, searching his face. "Are you all right?" He inhaled deeply, trying to manage the swirl of apprehension in his chest. "I'm trying to process the fact that I'm pregnant with an alien royal heir. I think all right might be too strong a word." A flicker of empathy crossed her features. "I understand," she said softly. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry you were thrust into this. I know it's not what you signed up for when you gave blood." A half-choked laugh escaped him. "That's a bit of an understatement." He fell silent, looking at her. Despite the uncertain predicament, he felt a small tug of gratitude. "I appreciate you sticking around. You could have turned me in or told the monarchy, right?" Kiritha's gaze dropped momentarily, her crest shifting in a subtle expression of vulnerability. "My oath as a nurse is to preserve life. And," she hesitated, as if checking her own emotions, "I feel protective of you, in a way. This is my responsibility as much as yours." Something in her tone stirred a warmth in Isaac's chest, a quiet ache he wasn't sure how to name. "Well, guess we're in this together," he murmured. She nodded, her eyes lingering on his. For a breath, the tension between them felt oddly charged, like they were two survivors clinging to the same piece of driftwood in a storm. He cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "So, what's the plan?" She took a small step back, regaining her professional composure. "We meet with Corleth. He's scanning your genetic profile to see if there's a way to stabilize the pregnancy. Your body is changing fast. I've noticed your abdominal region is starting to develop a secondary vascular system. I'd like to make sure it doesn't overwhelm your organs. He pressed a hand against his lower torso, feeling a subtle firmness beneath the flesh. The realization made his heart stutter. That's wow. Okay. It's best we act quickly, before any complications arise. She gestured for him to follow her. He rose, still a bit shaky on his feet. They exited the small chamber into a narrow corridor carved out of ruddy stone, reinforced with polymer plating. The walls emitted a low luminescence, and the air was thick and warm, reminiscent of a desert cave. Sand crunched underfoot in some places. It felt as if an entire new world existed below the shifting dunes above. They passed a few doorways sealed by Zalvari-coated locks. Isaac noticed a faint hum of electricity beneath the stone, telling him this outpost was quite advanced, though disguised as an abandoned mine, perhaps. Eventually, they reached a broader chamber with an arched ceiling. A single occupant stood near a console. He was a Zalvari male, shorter than Kirith but with broader shoulders and darker scales. His horns were smaller, curving only slightly, and he wore a loose-fitting robe that resembled battered lab attire. He looked up at their approach, amber eyes studying Isaac with keen curiosity. "You must be the famous anomaly," he said in a voice that managed to be both polite and uncomfortably direct. Isaac tried a wary smile. "Isaac Thorne. I guess that's me." Corleth inclined his head in greeting. "Corleth. I admit, I never expected to see a human male with a royal gestation imprint. Kirith gave me the broad strokes, but I'd like to see the data myself." Kirith took a step forward, placing a data crystal on the console. "Here. Everything I recorded on the station. You'll see the embryonic markers, the accelerated cell structures, and the telepathic readings." Corleth's brow ridge rose. "Telepathic readings?" He inserted the crystal and scanned the readouts. Then he let out a low whistle. "Incredible. The embryonic signature is faint but distinct. If it matures, it would generate a telepathic radius that could rival even the monarchy's prime lineage. This is truly extraordinary." His eyes flicked to Isaac. "And how are you handling it?" Isaac wanted to laugh at the question, but no humor came. "I'm not exactly the maternal type." Corleth's mouth curved in a Zalvari expression of sympathy. "Most hosts of the royal line have entire support networks and specialized biotech. We're improvising, which is dangerous. But I have some equipment that might help. Follow me." They entered an adjoining lab filled with diagnostic pods and holographic screens. Corleth directed Isaac to step into a cylindrical scanning chamber. Kirith hovered close, offering him an encouraging nod. He braced himself as Corleth activated the scanners. A swirl of azure light danced around him, and a tingling sensation spread across his skin. Holograms sprang to life in midair, an outline of Isaac's body from multiple angles. The display zoomed into his abdominal cavity, revealing a faint cluster of luminescent cells attached to a newly formed organ near his digestive tract. Even though the image was abstract, Isaac found himself breathless. A small, pulsing glow flickered at the center. Corleth studied it, tapping a stylus on various readouts. "Remarkable. The embryo is interfacing with your endocrine system, reprogramming your hormones. You're producing something analogous to amniotic fluid, though not in a conventional womb. This structure, it's forming a pocket along your intestinal wall, generating a membrane. The embryo's nestled there." Isaac's hands clenched involuntarily. His mind flashed through 100 scenarios of body horror, but also an odd wave of protectiveness. Is it viable?" Corleth scratched the base of one horn. "Potentially. Your body is being forced to adapt. I see heightened stress markers, which could cause complications. However, if Kirith administers the correct stabilizing proteins, we may mitigate the risk." He stepped out of the scanner, feeling dizzy. Kirith was at his side immediately, one hand on his shoulder. "You all right?" He nodded, exhaling shakily. "Just a lot to take in." Corleth gestured for them to gather by the console. "There's a bigger concern. This embryo isn't just any royal lineage. Based on the telepathic frequency, it appears it might be related to the High Empress line. That makes it extremely high priority for the monarchy. If they find you, their response could be extreme. They've spent centuries trying to maintain pure lines. Kiritha's eyes flicked anxiously to Isaac. We'll protect him. Corlith grimaced. Of course. But be aware, the monarchy has telepaths who can track such an embryo once it's mature enough to emit a psychic signature. We have a small window before it starts broadcasting. Isaac felt his skin prickle. Broadcasting? Telepathic resonance, Kirith explained quietly. Royal Zalvari can bond with each other over great distances. The embryo will eventually send out signals, especially in times of stress or rapid development. Corlith typed furiously at the console. I'll calibrate a dampening field to mask it. But that only buys us time. We can't hide here forever. Isaac cast a worried glance at Kirith. So what's the end game? For a moment, the Zalvari answered. Then Kirith breathed softly. We stabilize the pregnancy. We see it through. Perhaps we can find a way to ensure the monarchy won't destroy you, or the child. Corlith snorted skeptically, but said nothing. The tension in the lab thickened. Isaac rubbed his face with both hands, trying to muster the courage not to unravel. He'd faced firefights, bomb threats, the death of comrades. This was a different battlefield, a lonely one, inside his own body. A quiet voice in his head whispered that he was in over his head, that this was bigger than any fight he'd known. But Kiritha's hand on his arm steadied him, and for now, that was enough. They had no illusions about the danger. But at least, for the moment, they had a plan. Isaac found himself clinging to that fragile hope, even as dread coiled in his stomach. The flicker within him now felt more real than ever, pulsing like a second heartbeat, forging an unbreakable bond between him and this powerful, unknown life form. And, he realized with a jolt, linking him inexorably to Kirith, who had become more than just his nurse, she was fast becoming his confidant, his only ally in a hostile universe, and the one person whose presence made this impossible burden feel ever so slightly bearable. Night descended on the desert above them, but the outpost's artificial lighting made it hard to tell. Isaac found himself pacing the corridor just outside the lab, restlessly sifting through 1,000 questions. In the background, he heard Kirith and Corlith debating the next steps, their voices low and urgent. Occasionally, bits of their conversation drifted to him, talk of telepathic dampeners, hormonal stabilizers, the possibility of fleeing deeper into the desert. None of it sounded particularly safe. He leaned against the stone wall, sliding down to sit on the rough floor. He closed his eyes, thinking back to how his life had been just a week ago, a man haunted by war, making ends meet by giving blood and providing occasional security consulting. Now, he was effectively the carrier of an alien royal embryo, pinned between potential monarchy wrath and the threat of bodily meltdown. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh, except that every exhalation felt laden with dread. Mind if I join you? Came Kiritha's soft voice. He opened his eyes to see her stepping toward him, her tall form casting a long shadow down the corridor. She crouched next to him, her tail curling around her ankles. Corlitha's analyzing some test data. Thought I'd check on you. He forced a half-smile. I'm alive, so that's something. You. A wry twitch at the corner of her mouth. Same. Then, more softly. I'm sorry, Isaac. I know how overwhelming this must be. He exhaled slowly, looking at her. The corridor's dim lights accentuated the subtle ridges of her face and the luminous patterns under her skin. She seemed oddly vulnerable, not the unshakable nurse he'd first encountered, but someone who also bore responsibility for a crisis that had no easy solution. You keep apologizing. She dipped her head, the crest flattening slightly. Because I feel it's my fault. I'm the only Zalvari around. I took your blood, monitored the tests, told you the news. She hesitated. And part of me wonders if I could have prevented it. How? By never letting me donate blood? She looked away. I don't know. It's irrational, but it's there. He considered her, seeing the guilt etched in the slight tension of her shoulders. An unexpected warmth of sympathy rose in him. You're also the only reason I'm not in a monarchy lab right now, he pointed out. You're risking everything to help me. Trust me, that's worth a lot. Her eyes flicked back, and for a moment, he read something like gratitude there. Silence stretched between them, a tense but intimate hush. Then she spoke again, voice unsteady. This situation, carrying a royal embryo, would be daunting even to a Zalvari host who'd been trained for it. For you, it must be terrifying. His throat worked. It is, he admitted, letting the vulnerability ring in his tone. I've dealt with plenty of terrifying stuff in my time, was in the war, lost people, you name it. But this is different. It's inside me. And there's no manual for how to cope. She nodded. Sometimes, in our culture, there are telepathic bonding rituals that help share the burden. But you're human. I'm not sure if that would even work or if it would harm you. Everything is so uncertain. He studied her carefully, picking up the tremor in her voice. You've said our culture, but I get the sense you're not exactly close with the monarchy. Why is that? Kirith paused, a shadow crossing her eyes. I was trained in the Royal Medical Academies, yes, but I lost faith in them. Their strict hierarchy, the way they treat lesser lines and potential defectors, it all seemed too oppressive. I left, took work in frontier clinics where I could help multiple species. It earned me no favors from the court. In their eyes, I'm just a stray caretaker, squandering my training. A bitter edge sharpened her words. Isaac recognized that edge all too well, the voice of someone who'd turned their back on a system they once trusted. He thought of his own disillusionment after the war, how the official channels had left him feeling cast aside. Must be tough, he murmured. She glanced away, a faint shimmer running along her horns. We each have our regrets. Then she looked back, meeting his gaze with a searching intensity. I don't want to fail you, Isaac. I promised I'd help you see this through, and I mean it. A knot in his chest loosened. Thanks, he said quietly. I'm not used to having anyone watch my back these days. Their eyes lingered on each other for a heartbeat. Heat rose in Isaac's cheeks unexpectedly, and he cleared his throat. So, does Corleth have a next step for us? She drew in a breath, nodding. He's synthesizing a specialized protein lattice injection to help your body sustain the embryo. It should reduce any organ strain. But after that, we might need to consider leaving Calrath entirely. The monarchy's telepaths won't just give up. The implication made Isaac's pulse hitch. We'll be fugitives across the galaxy? She spread her hands in a helpless gesture. If it keeps you safe, maybe that's our fate. Unless you want to. She trailed off, eyes shifting with discomfort. He understood what she was suggesting, unless he wanted to terminate the pregnancy. The possibility hung unspoken, a taboo that neither of them had openly addressed. Isaac swallowed, scanning her face. As much as terror gripped him, an equally powerful sense of protectiveness had taken root. Maybe it was the embryonic hormones rewriting his body, or maybe it was an echo of paternal instinct. Either way, the thought of ending that fragile, flickering life made his stomach lurch. No, he said softly, but firmly. She nodded, relief and worry mingling in her features. Then we keep going, she said. And we'll face whatever comes. They both fell silent again. The tension in the corridor felt different now, no longer purely dread, but something closer, more intimate. Isaac's gaze trailed along the subtle pattern of her collarbones, the faint sheen of the scales at her neck. He found himself noticing how gracefully she breathed, how her entire body language felt coiled yet delicate. The nurse in uniform he'd first met was nowhere to be found. In her place stood a woman whose life and heart were entwined with his in ways either had asked for. I wish I had some sarcastic joke to lighten this, he muttered at last, forcing a small smile. She actually managed a soft laugh, the sound warm and husky. Sometimes laughter is the best medicine. I'd welcome any attempt. But maybe we're both too tired. Too tired and too scared, he agreed, letting out a breath. He felt the tension in his shoulders ease just a fraction. You know, if this were a Hollywood plot, it'd be so ridiculous I'd switch channels. her lips curved in what might have been a teasing smirk. And yet here we are, starring in it. They shared a moment of fragile camaraderie, two souls bound by impossible circumstance. Then Kirith touched his shoulder lightly. Come. Let's get some rest if we can. Tomorrow, we'll do the injection. We'll figure out our next steps. One breath at a time. He rose with her, matching her pace along the corridor. As they walked back to the living quarters, Isaac found himself stealing glances at her. An unspoken closeness simmered beneath the surface. It scared him even more than the monarchy, in a way, because it was beyond logic. A bond formed not just by necessity but by a raw, shared vulnerability that pried open old emotional scars in them both. Before they parted to their separate rooms, Kirith paused at her door and looked back at him. The faint glow of the corridor lights caught in her eyes, turning them to liquid onyx. Isaac held her gaze for a long, breathless moment. Then she inclined her head in a gesture of silent farewell, and he nodded back, feeling something wordless pass between them. By the time he sank onto the narrow cot in his chamber, his heart was pounding in a slow, irregular rhythm. He'd faced combat, lost friends, carried scars that would never fully fade. But this feeling, the confusing warmth of wanting to protect something inside him, and the equally confusing draw he felt toward Kirith, was like an avalanche, unstoppable. For the first time in years, he let himself wonder if he had the strength to open up, to let someone in, to face the unknown together. Sleep eventually wrapped him in its heavy arms, but the last thing he saw in his mind's eye was Kirith's face, shining in the dimness like a promise. He woke the next morning with a subtle ache low in his abdomen, like a tension that refused to fully relax. He pressed a hand there, half expecting to feel something shift or move. Nothing obvious happened. Still, a sense of strangeness lingered. The idea that an embryo was growing, a potential child, made everything surreal. Part of him still wanted to deny it outright, but the other part whispered that it was real, urgent. After cleaning up in the outpost's modest facilities, just a small shower cubicle with limited water, he stepped into the main lab area. Kirith and Corlith were already there, conversing in low tones by a table of equipment. A set of vials glowed with pale aqua fluid, lit from beneath by a console. When Kirith noticed Isaac's presence, she lifted one of the vials. "This is the protein lattice injection I mentioned," she said, carefully drawing the fluid into a slender hyposyringe. "It should merge with your bloodstream to reinforce the embryonic membrane and reduce your body's stress response." Isaac nodded, feeling a swirl of nerves. "Any side effects?" Corlith's horns tilted. "Mild fever, possibly some muscle tremors as your body integrates it. But it's necessary to keep the pregnancy stable." Kirith beckoned Isaac closer. The tension in her posture told him she was just as anxious. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing the faint scar of old bullet wounds. She pressed the hyposyringe to his arm, giving him a searching look. "Ready?" He nodded. "Ready as I'll ever be." A hiss of compressed air, a rush of cool liquid in his veins, and it was done. He exhaled slowly, rubbing the injection site. Within seconds he felt a subtle warmth spreading through his limbs. Not uncomfortable, exactly, more like a gentle flush. Kirith watched him closely, scanning his vitals on a handheld device. Her proximity made him keenly aware of how tall she stood next to him. She had to angle her head slightly downward to peer into his eyes. "You feel normal?" she asked. "Define normal," he quipped, only half joking. "I feel a little warm, that's all." She nodded, relief etching into her features. "Good. Let's see how you respond over the next few hours." Corlith typed a series of commands into the console, and the overhead lights dimmed. A holographic interface flickered to life, swirling with lines of text. "I'll be monitoring from here," he said. "In the meantime, you two might want to check the supply room. If you plan on leaving the planet soon, you'll need provisions." Isaac glanced at Kirith, who nodded. Together, they walked through the corridor to a chamber where sealed crates lined the walls. The outpost might have been small, but it seemed well stocked for survival: rations, water purifiers, medical kits. Kirith consulted a checklist, occasionally tapping notes into her datapad. Isaac tried to help, but his mind kept wandering, the new warmth in his veins making him restless. "You okay?" Kirith asked, noticing his distraction. He shrugged. "Just trying to figure out how my life got to this point. Checking crates for a fugitive flight, because I'm pregnant with an alien royal embryo. No offense, but I never pictured myself in this scenario." A small, ironic smile touched her lips. "I didn't exactly wake up one day thinking I'd run away from my own monarchy to protect a human carrying our future heir." She let out a soft sigh, setting the datapad aside. "I guess we adapt or break, right?" His gaze rested on her face, admiring the determined set of her jaw. "You've already done more for me than anyone else ever has." "I thank you?" She inclined her head. "You don't have to thank me. I chose this." Then a flicker of hesitation caught in her eyes. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Isaac, there's something I need to tell you, or rather, ask you." His pulse quickened. "Yeah?" She shifted her weight, looking momentarily uncertain. "The Zalvari have a technique, a kind of empathic link. It's not full telepathy, but it allows for deeper understanding of physical or emotional states. It might help me monitor the embryo's health and ensure your body doesn't reject it. But it would also open a channel between us that can reveal personal emotions." He felt an involuntary flutter in his stomach, not sure if it was from the embryo or his own nerves. "A channel like you'd sense my feelings?" She nodded, jaw tightening. "Only what you broadcast strongly. And I'd share some of mine, too. It's not entirely pleasant to open yourself that way. But it might be beneficial medically. I wanted your permission before even considering it." He swallowed, unsettled yet intrigued. Having someone in his head, even partially, was a terrifying thought. He was used to being a fortress of sarcasm, hiding behind bitterness. Letting Kira sense his raw emotions, his fear, his guilt, made his heart pound. But a part of him yearned for it too. He was lonely, unanchored, and she'd become a lifeline. "If it can help, then I guess we should do it." Her eyes searched his face, cautious. "Are you certain? We can wait." He took a shaky breath, bracing himself. "I'm certain. If it helps keep me and this child alive, I'll do it." She reached out and touched his shoulder, her scales cool against his skin. "You're braver than you think, Isaac." He let out a low laugh. "I'm definitely more reckless than I think, that's for sure." She chuckled softly, and for a moment, the air between them lightened. They returned to their tasks, sorting supplies. But the prospect of forming an empathic link hung over Isaac like a charged wire, leaving him alert and uneasy. In the distance, he could hear the soft hum of the outpost's ventilation, the occasional beep of Corlitha's console. The desert winds must have been howling overhead, but down here, the world felt sealed and secret. Eventually, the dryness in Isaac's mouth prompted him to grab a hydration pack from one of the crates. He sipped the purified fluid, trying not to dwell on the faint swirl of nausea in his gut. "So," he ventured, "this empathic link, when would we do it?" Kirith turned, placing the last ration pack into a satchel. "Soon, if you're ready. Corlith has a neutral chamber we can use, where the dampeners won't interfere. But maybe we should rest first. The injection is still settling in." His mind flashed to the sleepless nights and the ceaseless anxiety. "Yeah, rest might be good," he admitted. "I'm not exactly at 100%. A faint look of concern creased her brow. "You look pale. Let me check your vitals." He smirked. "You like playing nurse, don't you?" She rolled her eyes, an unexpectedly human gesture, and approached him with her scanning device. "It's my job. Don't flatter yourself." But despite the dryness of her tone, there was a gentle undercurrent in her expression. She held the device near his chest, reading his heart rate. "It's elevated. How do you feel?" He gave a half shrug. "Tired, mostly. A bit anxious. Surreal." Her lips tightened. "Try to rest. It's the best thing for you right now." Nodding, he followed her out of the supply room, leaving behind the stacked crates of gear they might soon need for a daring escape. The corridor stretched quietly, dim lights marking each step. He couldn't help but glance at Kiritha's profile: regal horns, scaled crest, the subtle feminine lines beneath her uniform. The presence of that luminous, foreign beauty reassured him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. At the door to his small room, he hesitated, turning to her. "Kirith," he said softly. "Thanks." She met his gaze. "For what this time?" "For everything. Not giving up on me. Protecting me from your own people, from the station, from whatever. Just thanks." She smiled, a real one that softened her alien features. "You're welcome, Isaac." Then she stepped away, leaving him to his thoughts. Back in the cramped room, he sank onto the cot, exhaustion weighing down his limbs. The injection's warmth still pulsed faintly through his veins. A swirl of new anxieties vied for his attention, but beneath them, something else emerged, a fragile sense of relief that he wasn't alone. That small spark of connection with Kirith, the nascent feeling he couldn't quite name, gave him strength he hadn't realized he needed. The embryo inside him felt like a cosmic burden, but for the first time since it began, Isaac let a hint of hope settle in his chest. Maybe they had a chance. He slept fitfully, dreams tangled in a web of half-remembered war zones and desert landscapes. At one point, he dreamed he was carrying a heavy bundle through a burning city. He stopped to unwrap it and found a small, glowing egg inside, pulsing with life. A voice whispered from the shadows, "Protect it, or all is lost." Then thunder roared, and Isaac woke, disoriented and sweating. After a moment spent catching his breath, he realized the thunder was real, sort of. A deep rumbling sound drifted through the walls, a sign of an approaching dust storm on the surface. The swirling sands of Kauritha's desert often clashed with the outpost's outer structures, sending vibrations down into the subterranean halls. The alarm system beeped once, then stilled, signifying that the facility's external shields had activated. Isaac exhaled, running a hand down his face. He rose, decided he was too restless to remain in bed. Stepping out into the corridor, he found the lights dimmed to night mode, casting everything in tinted shadows. A faint glow lit the path toward the lab. He figured maybe he could talk to Corlith or see if Kirith was awake, do anything to quell the anxious energy in his veins. He hadn't taken more than a few steps when he heard a soft sound from the main lab. Cautiously, he peered around the threshold. Kirith stood there alone, her back to him, leaning over a console. By the angle of her shoulders, she looked stressed. The tendrils of her crest drooped slightly, and her tail lay still, a sign of subdued tension for a Zalvari. Isaac hesitated. A part of him wanted to leave her be, but another part felt drawn to check on her. Mustering quiet footsteps, he walked closer. She noticed him in the reflective surface of a screen and turned with a start. "Isaac! You're awake! Did I disturb you?" He shook his head. "No. Couldn't sleep. You okay?" She sighed, rubbing her temples. "I'm monitoring the storm overhead. It's intense. We can't travel in these conditions. Corlith is resting, but I'm edgy. I don't know how much time we have before the monarchy picks up on your existence." She paused, then added softly, "And I keep wondering if I'm doing the right thing." Isaac stepped forward, daring a gentle hand on her forearm. Her scales felt cool, even through his own slight fever. "This is new territory for all of us," he said. "I can't pretend to know the outcome, but if you hadn't helped me, I'd probably be dissected on some monarchy lab table already." She swallowed, eyes dipping down. "I can't let that happen." Then she glanced at the console, which displayed a feed of swirling sands. The readouts indicated dangerously high winds, lightning strikes, and massive temperature drops. "I hate feeling powerless. That's one reason I left the monarchy in the first place. They make everyone feel powerless." He understood that helplessness too well. "You're doing a hell of a lot more than anyone else would. Trust me." She glanced at him, her gaze flicking to where his hand still rested on her arm. Instead of pulling away, she shifted slightly to face him. "I appreciate that. For a moment, the hush of the lab enveloped them, and Isaac became acutely aware of his own heartbeat. The pale glow of the console highlighted the subtle curves of her face, and he noticed the faintest flush of color across the ridges near her collarbone, an emotional sign for Zalvari. He realized he was close enough to see the quick rise and fall of her chest. His own breath caught. Without fully meaning to, he murmured, "You're the only reason I haven't gone crazy by now." A tightness flickered in her expression, as if she was fighting an internal battle. Then, with a sudden boldness, she reached up and traced her fingers lightly over the side of his face. It was a curious gesture, uncertain yet charged with a gentle intimacy. Her scales felt like warm silk. He shivered. "Kirith." Her gaze locked on his. "Sometimes, in my culture, a gentle touch to the face is a way of offering comfort and acknowledging trust." She hesitated, searching his eyes as if asking permission. He didn't flinch or pull back. If anything, he found himself leaning subtly toward her. The air between them hummed with a new electricity. An unspoken question lingered, one that neither could easily voice. They stood like that for a beat that stretched into eternity. Then footsteps echoed in the corridor, and they jerked apart as Corlith appeared in the doorway, looking half awake but alert. "Ah," Corlith said, blinking. "Sorry. I heard the alarm from the storm and wanted to." He trailed off, noticing the tension in the air. A flicker of understanding seemed to pass over his features, but he quickly cleared his throat. "I'll just, check the readings then." Isaac let out a silent breath, stepping away from Kirith. He felt a confusing swirl of longing and awkwardness. Kirith turned to Corlith, quickly slipping into professional mode. "The storm's intensifying. We won't be moving any time soon." Corlith grunted, tapping at the console. "It's massive. Possibly a day or two before it subsides." He glanced sidelong at Isaac. "How are you feeling?" Isaac cleared his throat, still shaken by the moment he'd shared with Kirith. "Feverish. But manageable." Corlith nodded. "That's expected. The embryo is responding positively to the injection, so you might see faster changes. No immediate danger, though. We'll reevaluate in the morning." "Thanks," Isaac said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Guess I'll, head back." He left the lab, feelings tangling inside him: gratitude for Kirith, attraction he didn't quite know how to handle, fear for the future. As he made his way back to his room, a quiet thought echoed. He'd known loneliness for so long, used sarcasm and cynicism as armor. Now, faced with an alien who risked everything for him, he felt that armor cracking, and it both thrilled and terrified him. Morning arrived with a calmer horizon. The dust storm's echoes still rattled the outpost's upper levels, but Corlith announced that the worst was over. They might be able to move within a day. In the meantime, he wanted to push forward with a specialized test, a partial neural sync that could glean more information about the embryo's telepathic potential. That was how Isaac found himself lying on a diagnostic bed, small electrodes placed on his temples, while Kirith stood nearby hooking up a second set of electrodes to her own scalp. Corlith hovered over the console, adjusting frequencies. Isaac's heart beat a little too fast, recalling Kirith's mention of a potential empathic link. Maybe this was a step toward that. Kirith laid down on a separate bed, parallel to Isaac. "We'll only be partially synced," she assured him. "It's more for data collection. But we will feel something, like faint echoes of each other's emotions." He tried to muster a confident nod. "Let's hope it's not too overwhelming." Corlith tapped a control. "Starting at level 1. An electrical hum filled the air, and Isaac felt a mild tingle spread across his temples, followed by a low rush of vertigo. He closed his eyes, focusing on his breathing. A wave of warmth fluttered in his chest, and for a moment, he thought it was just the embryo's influence. But then he sensed something else. A swirl of impressions, a faint taste of worry, a flicker of determination, and beneath that, a gentle stirring of compassion that didn't feel like his own. It dawned on him that he was sensing Kirith's emotional landscape. He inhaled sharply, opening his eyes to find her gazing at him across the small gap between their beds. He saw his own reflection in her dark irises. She gave him a small, tentative smile. You feel it? He nodded, words momentarily failing him. A subtle echo of longing threaded through the link, or was that in his own chest? Corlitha's voice cut through the haze. Vitals remain stable. Neural activity is elevated but within safe limits. I'm increasing to level 2. Another wave of mild static prickled across Isaac's skin, and the swirl of emotions deepened. He caught glimpses of Kiritha's memories, her shame leaving the monarchy, the sense of betrayal she felt from her own mentors, the heartbreak of patients she couldn't save. Simultaneously, he realized she was seeing flashes of his war experiences, the ravaged battlefield, the friend he'd failed to drag out of the blast zone, the guilt that haunted him. He clenched his fists, the intensity building. Kiritha's eyes widened, tears gathering at the corners. Isaac, she whispered. I'm so sorry. He didn't know if she was sorry for the tragedy she saw in his memories or something else. All he knew was that her empathy washed over him, a warm tide that soothed the sting of old wounds. He found himself returning the sentiment, though he wasn't sure whose feelings were whose anymore. You did everything you could, he breathed, not even sure what he was referring to. Maybe the monarchy's patience, or maybe him. She blinked, a tear slipping free, and his chest tightened with a surge of protective affection. Corlitha's voice sounded distant. All readings are stable. This is remarkable, a near harmonious link. The embryo's signal is also flaring. It seems to be responding. Isaac felt that signal like a soft glow in the background, a presence that pulsed gently between him and Kirith. It reminded him that this connection wasn't just the two of them, there was a third, unborn participant in their bond. An uncanny wave of awe swept him. He swallowed, turning his gaze fully to Kirith. She was looking right back at him, expression naked with vulnerability. Time stretched, the hum in the air thickening with every breath. Isaac felt tears burn behind his own eyes, a potent mix of relief and sorrow and gratitude. He'd never been so exposed in his life. Yet it didn't feel wrong. It felt essential. He heard Kiritha's voice echo in his mind, not exact words, but a sense of, I see you. I'm here. He thought back with, I trust you. Not sure if she'd get the message or if he was imagining it. But the softening of her gaze told him she understood. Then Corlith eased the controls, and the surge subsided. The electrodes powered down, leaving them both trembling from the emotional overload. Kirith breathed hard, her crest damp with perspiration. Isaac felt sweat trickle down his temple. He closed his eyes, trying to sort out which emotions were his own and which had been borrowed. His heart hammered so loudly, it felt like it might burst. Corlith stepped forward, removing the electrodes. That was something, he muttered. I've seen Zalvari pairs link like that, but never cross species. The readouts are phenomenal. There's a synergy that shouldn't even be possible. Clearly, the embryo's presence is bridging the gap. Isaac sat up slowly, rubbing his face. Every nerve felt raw. Kirith did the same, her face flushed, eyes still glimmering with unshed tears. He wanted to reach out and hold her, let her know he felt her sorrow and her courage. But they weren't alone, and everything felt too new. Corlith cleared his throat. I'll analyze the data. However, we must remain cautious. This link could strengthen. If the embryo grows rapidly, the monarchy might detect its resonance sooner than we'd hoped. Isaac's stomach nodded. So we're on borrowed time. Kirith rose, shaky but resolute. Yes. But maybe this link can also help us. If we can harness it, we might be able to mask the embryo's signal from within. Corlith offered a dubious frown. That's extremely advanced telepathy. Even among Zalvari it's rare. She squared her shoulders, glancing at Isaac. We have to try. Otherwise, we're just waiting to be found. Isaac nodded, though the thought made him tremble. He tried to center himself, focusing on that fleeting sense of unity they'd just shared. In it, there'd been a promise of possibility, maybe enough to outsmart an entire monarchy. He just hoped it wasn't wishful thinking. They spent the next few hours dissecting the data. Corleth pointed to waveforms on the console, explaining how the embryo's budding telepathic organ was interfacing with Isaac's neural system. Kirith proposed a training regimen to see if Isaac could consciously manipulate the resonance, a concept that baffled him. He never believed in telepathy at all, and now he was supposed to practice it? Imagine it like a muscle, she said patiently. They stood together in a corner of the lab, away from Corleth's clattering equipment. You focus on the sensations, try to tune them. We Zalvari learned basic mental discipline as children, but you never had that. It might be challenging, but you have the embryo's partial link to guide you. He frowned, closing his eyes as she instructed. I feel, not sure if that's my imagination. That's the baseline signal. Try to calm yourself, let your mind be open but still. Her voice soothed him, reminded him of the empathy they'd shared. He breathed in and out, letting the tension drop from his shoulders. For a moment he glimpsed a swirl of color behind his eyelids, something that felt like Kirith's presence, tinted with warmth and curiosity. He reached out mentally, not quite sure what to do, but wanting to find that calm center. His pulse slowed, and for an instant, he felt a flicker of acceptance, like arms wrapping around him in the dark. Then the feeling vanished, replaced by the clang of something in the next room. He blinked, turning to Kirith. I had it for a second. She smiled, gentle pride shining in her eyes. That's a start. We'll practice more when we have time. Corleth appeared, looking a bit flustered. Bad news. I picked up some coded transmissions. I believe the monarchy might be sniffing around. They're telling local outposts to watch for suspicious fugitives. They haven't specifically mentioned you, but it's only a matter of time. Isaac felt his gut lurch. So we have to leave. Soon. Kirith nodded. We'll wait until the storm's definitely passed. Then we head to the starport on the other side of the desert, board a freighter off-world. At least that's the plan. Corleth lowered his gaze. I can't go with you. I have too many experiments and responsibilities here. But I'll give you whatever you need to improve your chances. Isaac appreciated the help but couldn't suppress a fresh wave of anxiety. The monarchy was closing in, he was still physically unstable, and the entire plan hinged on making it across a hostile desert to an uncertain starport. Yet beneath his fear, a stubborn resolve took root. If he'd learned anything in the war, it was that when a mission mattered, you found a way. At his side, Kirith placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Their eyes met, and he sensed the same quiet determination that flickered in his own chest. They would face this together. He placed his hand over hers, letting the contact linger for a heartbeat. She squeezed lightly, and a warmth spread through him, part hope, part adrenaline. Because beneath all the logistical nightmares, one simple truth remained: they were protecting a life, however strange and unexpected. That life bound them in a way that defied reason. He might not fully grasp it yet, but he knew it was worth fighting for. They waited 2 more days for the storm to subside enough to travel. In that time, Isaac's body continued to adapt. He felt occasional cramps, mild shifts in his balance, and sharper senses. Sometimes he smelled Kirith before he saw her, the faint trace of her musky warmth that made his pulse quicken in ways he tried not to analyze. Their mental practice sessions grew more frequent. Each time, he managed to hold the sense of calm a little longer. The night before they planned to depart, Kirith came to his room. The quiet knock on the door jolted him from a half-doze. He opened it to find her standing there in simple desert attire, a loose, dark tunic tailored to accommodate her horns and scaled arms. She looked simultaneously regal and exhausted. "Mind if I come in?" she asked softly. He stepped aside. "Of course." The room was modest: a cot, a small table, a single lamp that cast warm light over the stone walls. Kirith hovered near the doorway, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. Finally, she sat on the edge of the cot, and Isaac took a seat on a nearby stool. "What's on your mind?" he ventured, clasping his hands between his knees. She studied the rough floor. "We're leaving tomorrow, heading into uncertain territory. I don't know what will happen if we get caught, or if we even make it to the starport. And I realized I might not get another chance to talk with you about something personal. His chest tightened. I'm listening. She exhaled, meeting his gaze with surprising directness. That link we shared, it opened me to your emotions. I've glimpsed your nightmares, your guilt, your guarded heart. And you've seen some of my vulnerabilities, too. We're connected now. And it's deeper than just an accident of the embryo. Isaac's throat went dry. He'd felt that connection, too, the way their hearts seemed to resonate in those moments of empathic overlap. Yeah, he whispered. I can't deny it. She wet her lips, a faint color creeping along her cheekbones. I care about you, Isaac. More than I should, perhaps. I don't want to complicate this further, but I can't pretend otherwise. His heart pounded like a drum. He rose from the stool and stepped closer to the cot. It's not just you. I care about you, too. You've changed everything, my life, my understanding of trust, of what it means to feel safe with someone. He hesitated, searching her face. I'm terrified. She nodded, standing so they were inches apart. The warm light played over her scales, highlighting the swirl of faint patterns. Me too, she admitted. Her eyes glistened with raw sincerity. In Zalvari culture, we don't form such deep bonds with non-Zalvari lightly. But this is bigger than tradition. It's about survival and something that feels real. He raised a tentative hand, brushing it along the curve of her jaw. I've been alone a long time. Didn't realize how lonely I was until you stepped into that clinic corridor. She exhaled, her breath trembling against his palm. Then, in a motion both graceful and urgent, she leaned in, pressing her lips to his. For a split second, Isaac's mind went blank, just the shock of soft warmth, the taste of her cautious breath. Then he sank into it, responding with a need he hadn't acknowledged. They stood there, lips melding in a tender, exploring kiss that gradually deepened as the tension of the past days spilled out in a rush of pent-up longing. Her arms slipped around his waist, careful of the healing shrapnel scars. His hands found her hips. Despite the differences in their bodies, her scaled ridges, his broad human chest, the contact felt achingly natural. He felt her heart thundering against him, mirroring his own. A fleeting thought warned him not to push too far, but the avalanche of mutual desire was hard to hold back. They broke for air, both breathing heavily. Kiritha's eyes were half-lidded, her crest flushed with color. I wasn't sure that was a good idea, she whispered. He chuckled, a throaty sound. It's the best bad idea I've had in a while. His lips brushed her forehead, where her horns curved. A wave of unexpected tenderness blossomed in him. Listen, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or the next day. But right now I want this. Do you? She closed her eyes, pressing her forehead to his chest. Yes, she breathed. I want to feel close to you. If we're risking everything, let's at least have this moment. His heart ached at the vulnerability in her words. He kissed the top of her head, inhaling her scent. With gentle motions, they helped each other shed the garments that separated them. He felt the cool hush of the desert night air against his bare skin, and the surprising softness of her scaled form. Every touch was a question answered in gasps and murmurs, the empathy they tasted in the neural link now manifest in shared physical intimacy. She traced his scars with reverent fingers, and he kissed the lines of her neck and shoulders where the scales blended into smooth skin. A million differences, yet none of them a barrier. The urgency of parted lips, the quiet moans that escaped them both, the flutter in Isaac's abdomen that reminded him they were never truly alone. But in that moment, it felt like a union of two souls forging comfort amid chaos. They sank onto the cot, their bodies tangled, hearts pounding in unison. The act itself was a dance of discovery, sometimes clumsy, sometimes electric, always teetering on the edge of wonder. Isaac felt a rush of warmth in his belly, as if the embryo was responding to the surge of shared emotions. A faint psychic echo shimmered at the edge of his consciousness, and he sensed Kiritha's love as tangibly as his own breath. By the time they collapsed side by side, covered in a light sheen of sweat, the room felt charged with the aftermath of a small miracle. He held her close, chest tight with a swirl of gratitude and fear and fierce devotion. She rested her head against him, her breath slowing to match his. In the dim lamplight, they exchanged a lingering gaze, no words needed to convey the gravity of what just happened. Eventually she dozed off, exhaustion claiming her. Isaac stayed awake a while longer, gently stroking her hair. His eyes stung with unshed tears. The intimacy they shared wasn't just physical release. It was an emotional surrender he hadn't thought himself capable of. For a fleeting instant, the burdens of monarchy threats, telepathic signals, and life-or-death flights vanished, leaving only the raw, beating truth. They were bound, in body and heart. And no matter what storms waited outside, that bond was worth fighting for. He let his eyes drift shut at last, drifting into a sleep that felt as close to peace as he'd known in years. And in the corner of his mind, he sensed a tiny, flickering presence, an unborn life pulsing with acceptance, warmed by the love that surrounded it. They left before dawn the next morning, when the desert's heat was less punishing. Packed with supplies Corleth insisted they take, rations, water, medical equipment, they climbed into a small hovercraft stashed in a hidden bay. The craft was battered but functional, designed to skim just above the sands. Corleth bid them farewell with a tense hug for Kirith and a respectful nod to Isaac. "Watch your back out there," he warned. "The monarchy will likely have scouts." Isaac and Kirith nodded, grateful for everything he'd done. Then, with a final hiss of the outpost's sealed doors, they maneuvered the hovercraft onto a ramp that led to the surface. The ramp opened to an expanse of golden sand shifting under the early light. Dunes rose and fell like ocean waves frozen in time. A faint breeze carried dust motes that sparkled in the sunrise, tinted with pink and amber. It was both haunting and beautiful. Kirith took the controls. She wore tinted goggles to protect her eyes, and a scarf draped around her horns to shield them from blowing sand. Isaac sat beside her, scanning the horizon with a pair of battered binoculars. "If we keep heading west," she explained, "we'll reach a small starport by mid-afternoon. It's run by a neutral trader group. We can book passage on a freighter out of here." He nodded, adrenaline buzzing in his veins. Despite the intensity of the previous night, he felt a strange clarity now. They were on a mission, and he had a purpose. Protect the child. Keep Kirith safe. Get off this planet. Step by step. The hovercraft whirred as it glided over the shifting dunes. Occasionally, Kiritha's tail flicked in agitation. Isaac tried to lighten the mood with a half-joke. "So, you ever do desert joyrides like this before?" She snorted softly. "Not with a pregnant human soldier in tow." He let out a short laugh. "Yeah, I guess that's a unique scenario." They traveled for hours, the sun rising higher, scorching the sky. The monotony of dunes occasionally broke into rocky plateaus or deep ravines. Isaac fought a constant sense of unease, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuers. They stopped briefly at midday to refuel the hovercraft and consume some water. Isaac felt a mild ache in his abdomen, but the protein lattice injection seemed to be holding. Kirith fussed, insisting on checking his vitals. He let her, grateful for her concern even if it brought a twinge of self-consciousness. By the time they neared the starport, a hodgepodge of metal structures jammed together at the edge of a sandstone cliff, the sun was dipping low. Isaac spotted a handful of ships parked on a large open pad. A perimeter fence surrounded the port, guarded by bored-looking mercenaries from different species. They passed the outer gate with minimal scrutiny, thanks to Kiritha's forged documents. So far, so good. The interior of the starport bustled with traders, travelers, and staff. The air smelled of fuel and grilled meats from a nearby canteen stand. Isaac stuck close to Kirith, mindful of her posture. She radiated tension, scanning the crowd for threats. The embryo churned softly within him, a subtle swirl of anxiety that might have been partly telepathic. "Let's find the docking registry," Kirith said, leading him through a corridor that reeked of sweat and stale beer. "We'll see which ships are departing soonest." They approached an old kiosk manned by a short, reptilian Gurlik, whose beady eyes barely reached the counter. Kirith conversed with it in a clipped trade language, inquiring about passengers' ships heading off-world. The Gerlich typed on a worn console, then hissed a response. Isaac caught fragments of the conversation, something about a freighter leaving in 2 hours, heading to a planet called Hudravel. Kirith turned to Isaac. "It's not luxurious, but it'll get us out of here quickly." He nodded, wiping a thin sheen of sweat from his brow. "Fine by me." They paid the Gerlich in a mix of credits and station vouchers, securing 2 spots on the freighter. The creature spat out a pair of laminated passes, then motioned them toward an adjacent corridor. "Dock 3. It rasped. Clutching the passes, they hurried away. Isaac felt a pounding in his chest, not sure if it was from exertion or nerves. The starport felt crowded, and each face that passed them could be an enemy. He held Kiritha's hand in a discreet grip, ready to bolt at any hint of trouble. She seemed equally on edge, her gaze flicking left and right. But they made it to Dock 3 without incident. The freighter loomed like a bulky gray beetle, its hull scuffed from years of cargo hauling. A few mechanical drones skittered around its exterior, patching hull plates. The cargo ramp was lowered, revealing a shadowy interior. A board-uniformed official, a tall Kairosh female with 4 arms, checked their passes. She barely glanced at them before waving them aboard. Inside, the freighter's cargo hold was a maze of crates, netting, and catwalks. A few other passengers loitered near a sealed hatch. Isaac sized them up, a hunched Balorian with twitching antennae, a stocky human mercenary with a scar down his cheek, and a pair of Saurian siblings speaking in hushed, melodic tones. No one seemed particularly interested in them. They found a corner to wait, the stench of industrial lubricants and stale air thick. Kirith leaned in close to Isaac, whispering, "We just have to endure the trip. Once we're in Hudravel's territory, the monarchy's influence is weaker. We can figure out our next steps there." He swallowed a knot in his throat. "Right." After a short wait, a loudspeaker crackled, announcing imminent departure. The cargo ramp hissed closed, and overhead lights dimmed. The engines rumbled to life, sending vibrations through the floor. Isaac's heart pounded. They were doing it, actually escaping Kalrath. If luck was on their side, the monarchy would lose their trail. If not, the freighter lifted off with a lurch, pressing them briefly against the deck. Kirith braced a hand on Isaac's arm, and he steadied her in return. A few moments later, the gravity stabilized, and a sense of weightlessness teased the edges of his body before artificial gravity kicked in. The cargo hold became a dim, rattling chamber, the hum of the engines punctuated by sporadic clangs. Kirith led him to a small alcove near the back, where they could sit on a couple of battered crates. "We should try to rest," she murmured. "It's a long flight." Isaac nodded, massaging his temples. A wave of fatigue washed over him, partly from tension, partly from the embryo's demands. He let Kirith wrap an arm around his shoulders, drawing him close so they could share a hint of warmth. He rested his head against her, eyes drifting shut. Each breath he took smelled of metal and her subtle, musky scent. Despite the rattling freighter, a fragile sense of safety crept over him, the knowledge that they'd at least escaped immediate danger. Time blurred. He might have dozed off, lulled by the repetitive rumble of the ship. At some point, the overhead lights flickered, and he heard Kiritha's soft voice. "Isaac, wake up!" He blinked, stirring. She looked tense, her eyes fixed on a figure approaching from the shadowy corner of the hold. A tall shape, wrapped in a dark cloak. Isaac felt the hair on his neck rise. The figure stepped closer, and he glimpsed a glint of silver eyes beneath the hood. Something about the posture screamed Zalvari. Anxiety knifed through him, and he tightened his grip on Kirith. She whispered, "Don't panic. Let's see what they want." The hooded figure stopped a few paces away, then slowly lifted a scaled hand to push back the hood. A Zalvari female, older, with intricate horn etchings that might signify high status. Her eyes flicked over Isaac and Kirith, lingering with a sharp curiosity. Isaac's pulse slammed in his ears. "Were they caught?" "Greetings," the stranger said, her voice low and resonant. "I sense your presence, Kirith." Kiritha's tail went rigid. "Who are you?" a slight bow. I am Sauron, an envoy of the monarchy. But do not fear, I'm not here to harm you. I have no official orders to seize anyone. Isaac glared, his instincts screaming. Then what do you want? Sauron's gaze slid to him, and he felt a faint pulse of telepathic pressure. Not the empathic warmth he'd shared with Kirith, this was something colder, more refined. I suspect you already know, human. The monarchy has learned of certain developments. A rumor that a new heir might be growing, in a most unexpected host. And rumors point to a renegade nurse named Kirith. Kirith moved as if to shield Isaac, her posture defensive. We're not looking to negotiate, she said tersely. Leave us alone. Sauron sighed, as though genuinely regretful. If only it were so simple. The monarchy does not condone harming an heir. On the contrary, they wish to bring it into the fold. But they are wary of cross-species anomalies. I, however, am no pawn of the court. I have my own reasons for traveling incognito. Let me propose an alternative. Isaac's heart hammered. We're not handing the child over. I'm not going to let you or anyone. Sauron raised a placating hand. Calm yourself. My proposition is that you come with me to a neutral location, where we can ensure the child's safe development. No monarchy labs, no forced termination. We could arrange discreet oversight by experts who can handle such an unprecedented pregnancy. Kiritha's expression twisted with distrust. You expect us to believe the monarchy is just going to let you do that? Sauron's pale lips curved in a tight smile. They don't have to let me do anything. I have resources, allies. You wouldn't be prisoners. You'd be guests under protection. She fixed Isaac with a piercing stare. The embryo is part of us, part of the royal line. It deserves to be raised with knowledge of its heritage. Isaac clenched his fists. I won't be your experiment. Sauron nodded gravely. I understand your fear. But you're carrying a child that could influence the future of my people. I would not see it come to harm. Let us help you, or eventually the monarchy will come for you with less polite intentions. Kirith and Isaac exchanged a tense glance. She murmured, How can we trust you? You can't, Sauron replied, inclining her head. But the alternative is braving the galaxy alone, hunted. And perhaps a slow unraveling of the pregnancy if complications arise. Think on it. With that, she stepped back, pulling the hood over her horns once more. I'll be on this ship for the duration, should you wish to speak further. If not, we will part ways on Hadravel. Then she melted into the shadows, her tall form disappearing behind a stack of crates. Isaac exhaled shakily, turning to Kirith. What in the hell was that? She shook her head. I don't know. But I know better than to trust a monarchy envoy's sweet words. He nodded, but a spasm of doubt gnawed at him. The dangers they faced were real, and Sauron's offer, while suspicious, was a reminder that solutions might lie beyond their lone fight. He pressed a hand to his abdomen, feeling a pang like a gentle protest from within. Kirith placed a hand over his. Let's not decide anything now, she said, voice trembling. We'll stay alert, watch her, and when we reach Hadravel, we vanish if we can. Isaac nodded, trying to steady his breath. Right. We didn't come this far to surrender. Outside the ship's hull, hyperspace beckoned, promising a new horizon. But inside, tension coiled, and the flicker of an uncertain future loomed, overshadowed by the monarchy's relentless claim. He squeezed Kiritha's hand, the only sure anchor he had. She returned the squeeze, and in that shared grip, he found enough fortitude to wait out the final hours of the journey, uncertain of what horrors or miracles might lie ahead. They touched down at Hadravel's orbital port a day later. The planet, known for its lush forests and sprawling oceans, was a stark contrast to Kauritha's desert. From the porthole window, Isaac glimpsed rolling green landscapes dotted with sparkling lakes. Normally, such a sight might have been breathtaking. But anxiety coiled in his stomach, overshadowing any wonder. Disembarking with Kirith by his side, he kept a wary eye out for Sauron. The cloaked envoy was nowhere in sight, at least not immediately. The starport here was large, bustling with travelers from dozens of species. Customs officers in crisp uniforms patrolled the main corridors. Kirith squeezed Isaac's arm, whispering, "We'll slip through the crowd, find a transport, and get as far from the official routes as we can." He agreed. They merged into the throng of arriving passengers. The terminals glowed with directional holos in multiple languages. Overhead announcements droned about connecting flights, trade protocols, and local weather conditions. Despite the swirl of noise, Isaac felt a hum of tension, a sense that eyes might be tracking them. They managed to exit the starport's security gates without incident, emerging onto a wide plaza filled with vehicles, hover cabs, cargo trams, personal skiffs. Kirith quickly flagged a cab. They climbed inside, telling the driver they wanted to head to the far side of Hudravel's main continent. The driver, a cheerful insectoid, only asked for half the fare up front. As the cab pulled away, Isaac gazed out at the passing cityscape. Towering spires of alien design jutted into the sky, connected by glassy walkways. Pods of swimmers drifted in skybound aquaria, tinted water reflecting rainbow patterns on the buildings below. It was all so vibrant, a far cry from the station's dull corridors or the outpost's dim caves. Under different circumstances, he might have marveled at it. Kirith maintained a watchful silence beside him, her posture rigid. Occasionally, she'd glance in the rearview mirror to see if they were being followed. Isaac did the same, spotting no sign of the cloaked envoy or any monarchy agents. Still, the tension never left his gut. They rode for hours, leaving the city behind, venturing into more rural landscapes. Wide fields of lavender-hued crops spanned the horizon, dotted with shimmering wind-harvest spires. The sky shifted to a pastel sunset. Isaac dozed off at some point, lulled by the gentle hum of the cab, waking only when Kirith nudged him gently. "This is where we part ways with the driver," she whispered. "We're close to the forests. We can find a place to lay low." He blinked, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. The taxi pulled over on a lonely stretch of road lined with towering, wide-trunked trees. Kirith paid the driver, who offered a polite click of its mandibles in farewell before zooming away. Dust settled around them. The air smelled of rich soil and distant blossoms. Overhead, birds with translucent wings circled in the twilight. "Now what?" Isaac asked softly, adjusting his pack. She glanced at a handheld NAV device. "There's a small settlement about 3 kilometers in that direction. We'll see if we can find lodging, maybe a discreet cabin. We need to regroup, figure out our next steps." He nodded, wincing as a twinge shot through his abdomen. She frowned in concern. "Pain?" "Just a little. I'll be all right." He didn't mention the subtle swirl of dread in his mind, like the embryo sensed danger. They set off along the dirt road that led into the forest, the tall trees arching overhead like living pillars. The canopy's leaves glowed faintly, storing sunlight for the night. Soft luminescent motes floated between the branches, casting dancing shadows on the ground. It might have been romantic under other circumstances, a tranquil walk with someone he cared about. But each crack of a twig made Isaac tense, scanning the darkness for potential attackers. After nearly an hour of walking, they spotted lights ahead, small lanterns marking a cluster of rustic huts. A sign in multiple languages read, "River Shadow Grove, welcome travelers." They approached cautiously, noticing a modest inn near the center. A few locals, a mix of humans and cat-like ferali, gathered around a communal fire pit, chatting. The aroma of grilled fish teased Isaac's nostrils, and his stomach rumbled despite the tension. Inside the inn, a cheerful ferali proprietor greeted them. Kirith requested a private room for a few nights, paying with untraceable credit tokens. The proprietor purred acceptance, handing them an old-fashioned key. They climbed a winding wooden staircase to a small chamber that overlooked the forest. It had a simple bed, a table, and a window draped with woven cloth. The entire place smelled of piney resin. Once alone, Kirith double-checked the lock, then leaned against the door, letting out a shaky breath. Isaac dropped his pack on the floor, sinking into a chair. Exhaustion weighed on him, body and soul. "God, it's peaceful here, but I can't relax." he admitted, voice hoarse. Kirith nodded, stepping closer. She lifted a hand to his chin, tilting his face up so he'd meet her gaze. In the dim lamplight, her eyes shone with concern. "We're safe for the moment," she whispered. "I'll set up a sensor to detect any unusual transmissions or telepathic signals." "Thanks," he murmured, resting a hand on her waist. "I don't know what I'd do without you." She offered a wan smile. "Likewise." Gently, she kissed his forehead. "Let's eat and rest. Tomorrow, we figure out if we can find a smuggler or a new identity for traveling deeper into neutral territory." The hours that followed were mercifully quiet. They ate a simple meal of forest stew and bread from the inn's kitchen, then returned to their room. Kirith placed a small device near the window, a scanning tool that pulsed faintly with electric light. Satisfied it would warn them of intruders, they settled on the bed. Isaac tried to sleep, but his mind spun with 1,000 fears: monarchy telepaths, Saren's offer, the possibility of the embryo's growth accelerating. He felt Kiritha's warmth beside him, and that helped, but the nightmares still poked at him. Eventually, around midnight, he got up to grab a drink of water from the small basin in the corner. Suddenly, the scanner beeped, a sharp, insistent tone. Kira's shot upright, eyes wide. Isaac spun toward the window. A swirling distortion shimmered in the night air, and then a figure stepped through. Cloaked, tall, a glint of silver eyes. Saren. Isaac's blood turned to ice. Kirith lunged to her feet, a defensive stance. "How did you find us?" Saren's hood dropped, revealing her regal horns and scaled visage. "I told you I was resourceful. The monarchy has many means, but I have my own. Don't be alarmed, I come alone." "Bull!" Isaac spat, fists clenched. "You break into our room in the middle of the night and expect us not to be alarmed?" Saren raised both hands in a gesture of peace. "Hear me out. I've come with an offer of sanctuary. I can take you to a safe place, a hidden retreat where the monarchy won't touch you, at least not openly. You can complete the pregnancy without fear of discovery." Kirith glared, though a flicker of uncertainty shadowed her eyes. "Why would you, an envoy of the monarchy, want to hide us from them?" Saren sighed. "My relationship with the throne is complicated. I believe a new heir could steer the monarchy toward reform. If the child is born under the monarchy's boot, it will be molded into just another tool of oppression. But if it's raised free, well, who knows what it could become?" Isaac's heart pounded. "And you get what out of it?" "Hope," Saren said softly. "I want to see my people evolve beyond our rigid hierarchy. A cross-species heir could be the key." Silence stretched. Kiritha's gaze flicked to Isaac, searching. He felt a swirl of emotions: suspicion, curiosity, desperation. Part of him wanted to dismiss Saren, but another part saw the glint of sincerity in her eyes. If they kept running, would they ever truly be safe? "You can't blame us for doubting you," he said at last. Saren's gaze dropped. "I know. And I don't ask you to trust me blindly. But consider the alternative: the monarchy's hunters, or living as fugitives forever. The embryo's telepathic aura will grow stronger. Eventually, they will find you." Kirith clenched her jaw, her tail lashing. "We'll talk," she ground out. "But no promises." Saren inclined her head, seeming relieved. "Thank you. I'll be staying in a hut by the far edge of the settlement. When you've decided, come speak to me." She moved to the window, pausing to glance back at Isaac. "For what it's worth, I sense the child is strong. You're doing well." Then she stepped backward, dissolving into the same shimmering distortion. The window rattled shut behind her, and the scanner beeped frantically before settling. Isaac exhaled, adrenaline coursing through his veins. "That's it. We can't stay here." Kira sank onto the bed, burying her face in her hands. "Maybe not. But do we keep running? Do we accept her offer? Either way, there's danger." Isaac eased down next to her, sliding an arm around her shoulders. He felt her trembling. "We'll figure it out," he promised, though the words sounded hollow in his ears. He pressed his lips to her temple, wishing he could whisk her away from this madness. Because in that moment, as the forest's night sounds mingled with his thudding heartbeat, he realized something: he loved her. The inevitability of it struck him like a tidal wave. And he loved the unborn child, too, this inexplicable life inside him that might one day shape the future of an entire species. He couldn't give up, no matter how impossible things seemed. They clung to each other, uncertain of what tomorrow would bring, but certain that they were not alone. And for Isaac, in the darkness of that alien forest, that knowledge, impossible though it was, became the closest thing to hope he'd ever known.